Hello, this is Stephen Dupree of NowEnergetics.com, based on YUEN Method and the Power of Neutrality. So today we're going to go over a course that I wrote some time ago, some number of years ago, that I used to do um, when I used to have healer shares, and I would go around occasionally and have these classes that I would give on neutrality and YUEN Method. And so the best way to do some of this work is to show folks how to do basic energetic testing. And of course, we have some articles on the Now Energetics and the Power of Neutrality websites on how to do that type of energetic testing, YUEN method style energetic testing. Here's Discern Truth with Energetic Testing. That's one article. And on my Power of Neutrality website, pretty much the basics is about the same article on the Power of Neutrality. So they're YUEN method principles, but you're just basically checking energy and using strong and weak. So it's really important to have those basics down to be able to assess where your energy is at, why you're reacting. You need to be able to check your energy at any given time. So we want to be, have knowledge of this type of testing and be very good at that kind of testing. And this will help you in very, very quickly getting to answers and doing either YUEN method work or neutrality work. It's sort of all the same type of thing. You're checking energy for weaknesses and you're strengthening them, whether they're neutrality based, whether you're deleting, when you're working with karmas or something like that. They all sort of overlap at some point. But today we really just want to talk about the neutrality aspect of the power of neutrality, and also YUEN method, which much of the YUEN method is based in neutrality, being neutral and getting to that state where you can get good answers. And most of the time you need to be very neutral in that state. So so this is kind of the worksheet that I hand out. I'm going to include it with this article or this video that I'm putting out with several articles that are related. And I think it's a good first step, sort of a level one kind of introduction to working with neutrality and working with some examples and with a worksheet where you can really make the most of, learning energetic testing and then applying it directly to, and numerical profiling, by the way, and applying it directly to getting your energy more neutral, where you can actually, by getting your energy more even and neutral, you'd be surprised at how many things that can shift, and how many bothers and symptoms and things like that that can shift just by going neutral to the real issue. And that's the real thing with any of this work, is most of the time people don't get the right answer, and that's why they still have a symptom or still are bothered by something. And so this process is really all about getting to the right answers, right? So and the way I teach it, I probably teach it differently every time. I'm not a PowerPoint person. It's sort of in the moment how I go about this. But in order to, give people some kind of reference, I had to, kind of write this document. So this will be, again, I'll upload it on my various channels. So we go through the basics here, neutrality, and some of this information is on, some of the articles that are on the Power of Neutrality website, and also the Power of Neutrality YouTube channel. So just be aware that those resources are there for you. So when we think of neutrality, most people would think of it being more of an uncommitted, indifferent, or apathetic kind of definition. And we don't use that kind of definition for neutrality. What we use is all of these sort of elements below here. You really don't want any bias. We talk about having no anticipation, expectation of outcome. We're not coming from a place of reaction or want or partiality. It's amazing how people that look at, energy in a certain situation, and whether it be, other modalities, they already have a charge and a bias on the situation. There's a heavy charge or bias on the outcome. They're wanting a certain very specific outcome, and they want to attract that outcome. Well, the best way to attract that outcome is not to focus on that outcome, right? It's paradoxical, but you really want to have as many outcomes of the same energy as possible. And usually when you're not getting that, something is way out of proportion, like millions of times out of proportion, such that you have no energetic support for the thing that you want. And most people don't think that. They think that they're focusing on it, so they must be, by focusing on it, they're going to get what they want. Well, most of the time they're consciously focusing, they would say consciously focusing on a specific outcome that they would want, need, or desire. But it's really about what's going on underneath in their energy. And their energy usually isn't supplying any lift to that desired state. It's actually just the opposite. They're energizing whatever, you know, situation is perpetuating, which is the current state, which is something they don't want, that they actually say they don't want. So it's very important to realize that we don't, it's where our energy is. It's not what we're saying, you know, or what we think, or even what we do to a certain extent. You know, if our energy doesn't support it, you're not going to get the outcome you want. And by energetic support, I don't mean the same kind of lopsided focus on the other end of something. Really, we're looking at even energy, you know, in all situations. And that's what is going to create the most, you know, kind of possibility of change, you know, where you have all the bubbling possibilities all even, so that there's something that could actually change. You're actually neutral in that state where you're kind of allowing, the energy is allowing something new to manifest, right? Not you personally doing it, but the energy that you've neutralized, that you've evened out, that's allowing the next, you know, the next manifestation to occur that's different than the one that you're in, hopefully, you know, if that's what you want. So so we talk about, you know, we talked about this, all possibilities or choices have equal charge. That's kind of a new concept to lay people, is that, you know, you're always, we're taught to always focus on a certain thing and avoid another thing. Well, with neutrality, you're really not trying to avoid anything, and you're not trying to focus on anything. And it's that scatterbrained, kind of scattered energy that we're told to avoid, that you don't want to be scattered all over the place. Well, actually, you do want to be scattered all over the place. That's the point of this work and of neutrality, of having equal energy, is you have the bubbling of infinite possibilities of all equal charge. And that's how something can actually change. It's not logical. You can't logically think this through. You can't force it. But when you have that equal charge on all the possibilities, is when you actually have the possibility of something changing or shifting in the next moment. And this is true of neutralities or YUEN method, right? So it's really important to get that concept. And a lot of folks, they just won't let go of that notion that they still have to focus on something. They're usually, again, their energy is not supporting what they say they want. So part of this work is to get them neutral, so that their energy does support what they say they want. So that's very important. So part of the neutrality, kind of the misinterpretation of neutrality by most lay people, is they think that there's some sort of disinterest and indifference. And actually what neutrality is equal interest and equal kind of focus across the board. So it's the opposite of what most people would say, is that, well, you're detached and disinterested. No, I'm interested in every single outcome, and I'm not focusing or biased on any particular one. And that's when you're going to get the best manifestation. So that's the whole, you know, kind of notion of neutrality in a nutshell, right? So the neutral person is actually very interested in experiencing all situations equally. That's kind of a hard phrase to swallow, but it's really the basis of neutrality, right? You're not, there's no focus, there's no avoidance, and there's no middle way. You know, people talk about the middle way. There's no middle way. There's all ways of all the same energy. There's no, because even the middle way is like, well, I guess I'm avoiding the extremes if I'm going the middle, right? And that notion, you know, for some people, that's their understanding of it. But really, with neutrality, we're not looking at the middle way as being any more preferred as any other, you know, any other experience or any other extreme or anything in between any extremes. You know, they're all the same energy to us. So it's a long way of saying, you know, people really have to get this concept of unfocusing instead of focusing, and being more scattered about their energy, and not about their thinking so much, but about their energy, and being neutral with that. You know, that their energy can be scattered equally across all possibilities. So here it says neutrality means there's no bias toward wanting the so-called positive situations and avoiding the negative ones. And those are all judgments anyway. What's positive one day could be negative the next and vice versa. So you don't want to judge it either way, really. You know, you don't want to have a bias. You don't want to have a focus. And, you know, of course, part of the difficulty of getting neutral is that we also are influenced by the psychic energy of people around us, about, you know, sort of the environments and so on. And, you know, just people are reacting all around us, you know, and we have this in our everyday lives in the normal course of the day. And it's, you know, we want to get neutral so we're not either reacting to their situation, or so we had a bit of an interruption there going over this form. So I'm just going to continue on from what we have here. So we're talking about neutrality, and we're talking about really our definition of neutrality, which is having really no bias. And that's a really hard concept for folks that are in the positivity movements and so on. And the truth is, there's nothing wrong with being positive, but you want to also have the energy the same to be not positive and negative and not negative and anywhere in between, right? So there's no notion of one extreme or the other, and there's no notion of what we call the middle way that some people talk about. I think the Buddhists talk about that. Well, we're saying we're encompassing all of those things: the positive, the negative, the middle, everything in between. So these are kind of millions of points of energy of situations, and we're going to say that we want all the energy of those individual points even with each other, right? We're not going to prefer one. That's what it means when you're not going to prefer. It means they're all the same energy, you know. So it's like going down to the store and getting a Kit Kat bar or something. There's 10 of them there. You just pick one, right? They're all the same. So that's how you want the energy to be too in these situations. Once you figure out what you're not neutral to, right? So you want to strengthen that energy of what's weak up to the same level as all the other things that are already strong, which is usually the story that someone presents. That's the problem, you know, a certain thing that bothers them or whatever. It's almost never that story, right? They've already strengthened it by thinking of it. So they're already neutral to the thing they're complaining about, right? The person is complaining about. So that's very important. And if you're working on yourself, same type of thing, you know, get out of your story, check the energy, get out of your story, use energetic testing, make sure you can set that story aside so you can look at the actual issue, that you can use your insight and actually get to the root of the problem, you know. So, and one of the things that's a challenge is that, you know, and I'm writing an article for YUEN Method and neutrality for empathics, because it's a little more challenging for people that are empathic, because they tend to be more affected by energy. You know, some people would say they absorb energy or they're a sponge. Well, there's different degrees of empathy and empathics. And in the same way, there's different degrees of how much psychic energy you may you know, be affected by, let's say, that affects your energy. So it could be some part of your own energy that sort of puts out a tuning fork and you pull in the collective, or you may have just a huge energy in your own self. And that's, you know, that's, let's say it's collecting all the energy around you, let's say from people in a room or an environment, that kind of thing. So so that's, we're always dealing with that with neutrality. We're always dealing with other people's energy, the energy of the environment, the energy of other things, our ancestors, and so on. So it's a little more of a challenge for empathic people, but you still can get more neutral, right? So, and we always talk about, even in YUEN Method, talking about, you know, energy and having weaknesses in our energy. And as soon as you have a weakness, something's going to slow down, you know. So this is where, you know, we can get all these different sensations, is because we're actually you know, a weakening energy in an area, even though it may be a non-physical source, could create a physical problem in a certain area. So many times we say, you know, that's not where it's coming from or whatever, but the truth is that, you know, it's kind of directed into an area, even though that's not the source of the problem, right? So it could be a shoulder or back or something like that. The source of the problem could be anything, some issue of, you know, neutrality or something like that. It just happens to focus in that area. So we have to kind of know that that's, you know, that's again another case of getting out of your story, right? Knowing where it's coming from. So we talk about all these different sensations. There's a list of probably 18 sensations, pain, discomfort, irritation, achiness, burning sensation, pressure, struggling, suffering, hurting, fighting, all those ones that we usually talk about, where they're mental sensations or physical sensations or combination of both. Irritations, kind of a combination of both physical and non-physical, right? You can be irritated and you can have an irritation as well. So those two kind of play off each other very often in our energy work and in our neutrality. Words that have double meanings in both the emotional and in the physical. So that's important to be aware of that. It could be, like I said, one could be influencing the other, and they may resonate with each other. So and it's also important to know that the energy was there first, right? We always get it backwards. We say, well, I got the pain, and that's why I have a sensation there. No, you had the weakness there first, and that created the slowdown, and that's what created the sensation there. So make sure that we have that in the right order. So so the energetic weakness, it's like any other weakness that we find. We have a worksheet that I'm going to scroll down to in a minute, and we'll go through an example here. So the important thing, this is more like the basics of energetic testing. You want to stop thinking to get neutral, and you want to feel and perceive the answer being whether something's weak or not, right? If it's strong, we're going to move on. We're not going to even deal with it. We're going to pass that to the side, right? Very quickly. So we have to be able to be very quick about letting go of stories that are strong. Energetically strong means there's nothing to do, move on, right? So it's really important. So and the words that we use, sometimes the language kind of messes us up a little bit. We kind of talk about using our insight and our intuition. I'd rather use those words than our feeling, because people mix up those words with how they talk, the language itself. I feel this, I feel that, I feel sad, whatever. And it's really, the feel really means in that case that you're experiencing the motion of sadness, but we don't actually say that because it's too long to say that. So we just say feel sad, but that's just the way the English language is. But just be aware that we're really trying to use our intuition, use our right brain, using our insight to get an answer of strong and weak, usually, in less than a second, right? So we want to know what weakens our energy. That's how, that's the thing that opens the door to real change. So and there's always this notion too that, when we start this work for the first time, we think we've left our thinking, and we haven't in many cases. So be very aware of that you want to get into your feeling very quickly. If you posit a word, you posit, any kind of concept that you're testing for neutrality, you want to put it out there, but you want to quickly put away your thinking. And the thinking goes away as soon as you think the thought, right? You're going to immediately go into your intuition to see if it's strong or weak. So that's really important. And that's just basic energetic testing. So let's move on a bit here. So neutrality isn't coping. That's really important to know, that we're not coping with anything. We're not using the false tools of suppressing it, denial, so on. And many times, we may have to hook in part of the YUEN method to delete these things, or, we can go neutral to them, but we can also delete the effects of these things, even with neutrality clearings, because many times there's layers to, we've suppressed something so long that we're not neutral to, that we kind of collected up energy in a certain area. And that's where you can get, sensations and so on, irritations, pain, discomfort, so on. So, and so neutral is not any kind of assumptions or guesses either. We don't want to hear too much of our own story or someone else's story if it isn't weak, right? If it doesn't go weak, those are the indicator of something to work on. And positive affirmations, those are nice things once you're neutral. But if you're not neutral, they're not going to really do much good, because most of the time you're already strong to the thing that you're talking about, or there's some trigger there. If you're not at ease with what you're talking about, if you have some bother, then there's usually something underneath that needs to be, figured out to go to neutral on, so. And, this notion of neutrality for a lot of people too, we're talking about the definition earlier, and it's not really, the definitions that are out there is more that we're indifferent and that there's no action, we're just sitting back or something like that. It's just the opposite, where we want to activate our neutrality. So we want all of those let's say a point between the two extremes of a certain neutrality, we want to have equal energy. So we're pushing that energy, we're strengthening it. So we're pushing that energy so that it's all equal. So it's the opposite of inaction. It's total action. So it's very important to know that with neutrality, it's a very powerful, energetic place. People always talk about positivity, and it's really neutral. Is really, it encompasses both the positive and negative. So it's actually a higher energetic state from our standpoint. So you want to be able to experience both of those extremes without reacting to either or anything in between extremes, right? Of positive and negative of any particular situation. So, and we talk about here, most people get, try to think through all their problems, and we know that that doesn't really work for most people. So, or you'd resolve the situation, you'd get, your energy would be strong and you'd be neutral and you'd move on to something else. So it's important to be aware that if our situation isn't changing, we don't have the right answer. So that's real basic principle here. If your situation isn't changing, you don't have the right answer. So people will, believe that they have the right answer. They'll, do all kinds of research, but if your energy is not shifted and you don't perceive a difference, you don't have the right answer. So that's really important. It's important in YUEN Method. It's important in neutrality as well. So, so one of the things, if you have this non-neutral energy, it could be anywhere. We always talk about the extremes, but someone could be weak in the middle of a neutrality. So let's go with the positive and negative situation. Well, somewhere in between here, a lot of people are, not too neutral with the in between, the squishy middle. So it's not always on the extremes that someone might not be neutral and have some issue with. Even going through daily life is harder for someone who's sort of weak in the middle, because most of your life it's weak in the middle. Most of our lives are in the bell curve of the middle. So, we want to be especially neutral to the middle, and you'll find some people that are, that have some issue with the middle. We talk about, Buddhists talk about the middle way. A lot of people have issues with the middle. So they hit a neutrality immediately issue. If they have an issue with the middle and you're telling them to go to the middle, they got to deal with that, and figure out that that's really their issue. And usually the reason why they would stay on the extremes is because they're avoiding the middle to begin with. So that's, know where you're at in your energy, know what you're avoiding by checking the energy. That's really important. So a lot of times the reaction is what supplies the energy to move on further, so we talk about that sometimes the reaction energy is all about, we actually create that situation, we attract that situation, or we perpetuate a situation because we need that energy, right? We can't figure out what the heck's going on. So we let ourselves get lulled into some weakness, and it actually, at some point you hit the bottom and you react out of it. And that reaction energy, very often people misinterpret that reaction energy as, gee, I figured out my problem. I just had to get angry, and that's not what it is, right? So that's just reaction energy. That's not true neutrality. So that's something to be aware of. That it comes up very often actually for people to react out of their non-neutral state, thinking that they've solved the problem, and they really haven't. So we talk about this boost only lasts a short time. So you end up going up and down like a yo-yo, because you got to keep supplying energy. So you got to keep reacting. You got to find more things that bother you so you can react, that kind of thing. So it seems like you're solving problems perhaps from the outside, but your energy is not neutral on the inside. So we want to always pinpoint what's bothering us, and it's never what we think it is. And when we say we want to remove the charge on a situation, we're actually equalizing the charge too, when you think about it across all the possibilities, right? That's what true neutrality is. So we talk about this section here. It talks about, so this is a worksheet that you can go through and people can download this. You want to prepare by strengthening your perception, and we have articles on the Power of Neutrality website about dealing with perception blocks and so on. So we want our perception not to be distorted, so we know if there's a shift, we can actually perceive the shift that's taken place, right? That's a really important thing, that a lot of times people actually, they actually go neutral, but they can't perceive the neutrality. They actually have even energy, and they've actually got themselves neutral, but they can't perceive it, right? Because they have some perception block. There's all kinds of perception blocks. There's judgment of, kind of the past and the future. You've changed, and now you have some issue with change, or it could be a time weakness of some kind. It could be you can't perceive it for another 3 days type of thing. So your energy would be strong, but in that case, time, you'd have some time issue. So it's really important to know that. You want to have an awareness. So this is a part of it too, is just having an awareness of what shifted, right? Your energy shifted. You want to have immediate awareness of it. And we always talk about, we don't want to be 100% intuitive and no logic, or 1% logic and 99% intuition. It should be 50-50, right? It's another evenness, another neutrality, and neutrality is evenness. So why wouldn't these two things be even too, right? So that's totally what it should be. And then the process, like we said, preparation, and then you find out, you create an example of what really is bothering you. And the worksheet goes through this, figure out something that bothers you and go through the worksheet and feel for the weakness, right? So, and then when you find something to work on, you create the extremes of the best scenario and the worst scenario. We call it the best and worst. It's the English language. It's, we don't consider any one more important or positive or desired than another. So, but we call them the extremes sometimes because that's a little bit less biased, but for the lay folks, the best and the worst scenario is usually what, the best way to describe it for most people. And then you measure the results, is there a shift, same or different, or do you have to go another layer? And the other layer may say maybe something like you get to some point in the worksheet and you say, well, it still bothers me. Whatever it was, it still bothers me. And you go a layer deeper. Well, what bothers you about that? What bothers you that it still bothers you? It could be all kinds of threads. It depends on the subject you're working on, but you drill down a bit further into the questions and you may find something else that goes weak, in terms of a neutrality. And then you want to paint those extremes and go neutral to those extremes. And then check your energy again, see how you're doing, see how the person's doing if you're working with another individual. So, so examples of overreacting, allergies, so on. And here's a pretty common triad that we use sometimes with allergies, most often with allergies, but you can use it with different things too. That's another element of the YUEN method that you can use, where you can clear this to neutral all to that triad. So one of the things you find with this work is the very positive words usually weaken people the most. So believe it or not, people that talk the positive games, a lot of times those words weaken them or weaken the person around them, or they attract that energy from other people, the positive energy, and then it weakens their energy when some people are positive around them. And the example would be, well, you kind of it bothers you when positive people around you, as an example. So that would be a case where, positivity actually bothers the person, right? So we have to figure out what's going on in their energy to make that actually happen. And here's a list of words, it's not exhaustive, but a list of positive words that you would think people would be, their energy would be very neutral to these words. It's just the opposite. They usually are very weak to some of these words, sometimes all of these words, right? Notice they're mostly positive. Believe it or not, we're already neutral to the negative stuff. We say we don't like it. We say that bothers us, but, and you can hear people talk about in the more extreme, the description, they're usually, they'll use words like, a person might use words like devastating or excruciating. Well, the more weight a certain word has, it just means that they're that much more strong to the negative side, what, quote unquote negative side of that neutrality, of that situation, of that thought. So believe it or not, if you check the energy, most people are very, very strong to the negative side. So that's why we have to throw away that energy very quickly, to throw away those the stories very quickly, because they're all about negative things that we're normally already neutral to, right? So that's real basic thing about throwing away the story. It's usually that negative story that it's just, hey, you're already strong in that. You already got that base covered of, the catastrophic situation. You talk about it so much, you're already neutral to it. You don't have to know neutrality and energy work to get your energy strong. Just by focusing on something long enough, you're going to strengthen it. So you're actually, most people are very neutral to the worst, what they would say the worst scenarios, right? So I like some of these quotes. Dr. Bartlett does a modality called matrix energetics. He's a very entertaining guy. I think he was a YUEN Method practitioner at one time in the early days, and he does his own thing now, but he's got a great take on neutrality. Dr. YUEN talks about neutrality all the time. I think Richard Bartlett talks about it, and I like his take here, this particular quote. When you're neutral, there's no charge upon an experience. Therefore, one experience is equally weighted with another experience. What a great way to describe it. Once there is no charge on an outcome, the outcome can actually change. And I would say too, once there is equal charge on all outcomes, something can change. It's paradoxical, and I wrote an article about that, but that's basically true. So, but in order to get to the point of no charge, you have to stop thinking. So that's the whole point of that, is that your thinking is keeping the charge on the situation. And of course, here's Dr. YUEN has got a couple of good quotes here. You want to be in that neutral place. If something troubles you, you'll just have more of it. So he says, you're just going to attract more of what bothers you. So that's pretty much a basic principle. That's the real law of attraction. That's true. I've seen that. And it's time to recognize and acknowledge the strength and neutrality. You can be above it all in life and not resort to continually playing the game of positivity and overriding or overcoming the negatives. So we push a lot of these things down with positivity. Well, we don't really get rid of them. We suppress them. We deny them. We lie to ourselves. We practice forgetting. We numb ourselves. We shut ourselves down. All those are negative things that you're not really getting rid of the problem. You're just pushing it in a corner somewhere. It's going to come back with a vengeance eventually. That's why we want to find these things that we're not neutral to and get neutral to them, right? So here's the neutrality worksheet. This is the worksheet I use in some of the classes that I used to teach. This is a fairly old worksheet, but it's not like there's anything new under the sun with neutrality. In my opinion, so it's a fairly simple concept to talk about and to bring into your life. And the important thing here is, we want to throw out as many stories as we're checking the energy, as we're positing what's bothering us. We're checking the energy, and we're only working on things that are weak. Anything that's strong is, already neutral, already the strongest energy it could be. You're setting that aside. So you want to look at only the things that weaken our energy, the issues of neutrality that weaken our energy. And we talk about, some of this is already in the other section of the document of preparing and then measuring results. So there's, 3 or 4 steps here, writing down what bothers you, and then finding out what the real weakness is, because when you test the thing that bothers you, right, waiting in a long line, there's no weakness, most likely, right? And so we want to keep asking ourselves, well, what bothers you about waiting in line? Because that's not weak. And it might be something related to where you are, and not so much that you're in a line, as an example. And if you ask a few questions, and what you're trying to do is figure out what goes weak. And if it doesn't go weak, you keep, asking, right? So, and then let's say you do find what bothers you, you go to the best and worst case scenario. So I don't want to get too far. This is the worksheet. So, and here's another example. You get angry when, similar thing. And then when you strengthen it, if you figure it out, if you go down 3 layers, now you think about it again, does it still bother you? Or do you have to go another layer? And what we do usually is we paint out the best and worst scenario extremes. Think about the worst possible failure you can imagine that you're totally strong to, usually, most people. And then, the best possible success. And most people are totally weak to that, even though they say they want success and they're constantly failing. Well, that's where all your energy is usually, right? If you want to look at the success failure duality is a common thing in neutrality, or abundance and poor, poverty kind of thing. It's the same kind of thing. So, and I have an example here, and this example is about waiting in the line. And there's always a surprise, because whatever you think it is usually strong. So whatever you get eventually is going to be a surprise to you, right? And it may be an opposite, it may not be an opposite. We work a lot with extremes. So when we think of extremes, there's the extremes are the opposite. So a lot of neutrality work is being on the right side of being able to strengthen a particular weakness and knowing that's what it is, right? So we can always be totally on one side our whole life and not realize that that's not our problem. The failure issue is not the problem. Our energy is completely there, strong, neutral. We can fail a million times and we're totally okay at neutral with that. The energy's strong to that. It's even the littlest success, you just ping-ponging back. And that's might be where the energy is weak, as an example. So that's a very common one. But here, it's somebody waiting in a line and the person says they're irritated. So you go down several layers of questioning. And as we go through this, you can see we're testing as the person says things. We can test the word that's not weak. It's upset, that's not weak. I have no control over my time. So that's what went weak. It's something about, so let's say we get something that goes weak. We still don't know what extreme it is. So let's say it's a control issue. You think, control of my time. Okay. So, you think that, look at what's actually weak for the person, right? What's their complaint? I have no control. Were they weak? They have total control. They're totally weak to having total control. They're completely okay with and neutral with having no control over anything. So all their energy is there. So they attract these situations where, and they can attract situations or thoughts that have to do with, completely being out of control, right? Or having no control over a situation. So very often it's just the opposite of what we thought. Here's the time one. Always having enough time to do, having so much time on your hands, you can do anything you want. They're totally weak to that. Right. So that's not what you'd expect, but that's what typically goes weak. So that's why we have to know, we have to see what goes weak. Here are two issues here, being in control and something about time. And even when you have the words and the concepts that go weak and you paint out the extremes, very often it's the opposite extreme of what you thought it, would probably be the issue, whether it be in here of, not being in control or, not having enough time. It's just the opposite. So when we strengthen these things to neutral, then we ask the person, same or different, right? Did you notice a shift? So here's a section here where we kind of go through talking about, it's not what we thought it was. So be prepared to be surprised in this work. You're always going to be surprised in this work, and we should be surprised in this work because whatever the answer is, we haven't thought of it yet, or we haven't tested it yet. So whatever we think it is, it's already usually strong. Okay, so, and here's a good example of, if you're working with somebody and how you deal with asking the question, right? And if something still bothers the person and they're not totally neutral, there may be another layer about control, about time. And you just have to ask a question, if it still bothers a person, what bothers you about, what you just strengthened up here, right? So, what's weaker? What's weaker than having all the time in the world and being weak to that, and you strengthen it and say, well, it still bothers me, let's say the person said that. What would be even more extreme? We want to go further into the extremes now. We went to an extreme, but now we want to stretch the string even further because it still bothers a person. We haven't gotten neutral to enough situations or thoughts. So we ask again, are we into it that, well, gee, you're pretty neutral to having enough time, but if you have all the time in the world and you can't finish the thing you want to finish, that bothers you more than having all the time in the world that you were weak to before. So there are things that can go weaker. And so that's another extreme. Having enough time and not having time to finish. Thinking you're not going to have the time to finish, right? So the thought of leaving something incomplete. So that may be another neutrality. So look where we came here, with time. We were looking at someone waiting in a line, and we went down several layers about control and time. And then we get down to the very bottom layers of the neutrality, and it's really not being able to finish things. It's leaving something undone. So that's the deepest neutrality that this person discovered by going through this process, right? So when you have this neutrality around complete neutrality about leaving something incomplete or completing something, you know, completely finishing something or leaving something incomplete, you want to be neutral either way or anything in between. You want to be more neutral with that, then time issues won't bother you and control issues won't bother you in this case. Let's say let's use this example here. So that's the whole point of this, is that you get more neutral in that situation. So instead of sitting in there, so imagine the person in line at the Starbucks. Before they're waiting in line, they're bothered, they're reacting, they're starting to get hot under the collar. Now that same person, because we know what the layers were and we got the person's energy strong to these things, and we deleted all the, by neutralizing that, by painting the extremes, we neutralize that energy. So now they're waiting in line there like there's nobody in line. You know, it doesn't, they're looking at the pictures on the wall or something because that doesn't bother them anymore. That's the ideal situation where you get neutral to these things that bothered you in the past. And you can't even think the thought now that the line is going to bother you, right? So it's you know, completely, it's almost like you're a different person. You are a different person at that point, right? It's like you went through the Star Trek transporter and you just came out a different person, right? That's really what happens here. You know, you neutralize that energy, and then, you know, you have something that might have been bothering you for 20 years. You know, it's, you know, kind of the impatience of waiting in a line, and suddenly that's completely neutralized, right? And by neutralize, you can, the bad way to say it is to put up with it, but really it doesn't bother you at all. So it's not even that you put up with it. You're so neutral to it, it doesn't matter. You know, it's like reading a book or something. You know, it doesn't, has no effect on you, is what we call it, right? So so just be aware of that. So this is the worksheet. So I don't want to get, you know, this has been a long video, but I think it's really important to really explain the elements of this that overlap energetic testing and YUEN method, because a lot of the principles come from that. Without energetic testing, it's very hard to do this kind of work, to have the kind of insight to know really what's going on, which energy is weak. And it's still weakness of energy, right? It's all the indicator of weakness telling us what we're not neutral to, you know, and often it's the opposite of what we think, or it's some area that we never thought of before. It could go down many layers. It's not always exactly the subject we're talking about. You know, waiting in a line and, you know, completing something aren't two things that you would think are tied together, but they're tied together in this case as we go a layer deeper, right? So that's important. So anyway, so so this is the worksheet. I'll put it up on the website. If you want to contact me, you can use this info@powerofneutrality.com, or you can contact me or watch my videos on the Power of Neutrality YouTube page. I also have a page on Rumble with most of the videos are kind of jumbled together with YUEN Method videos. And I also have a sister channel, Now Energetics, which is really, this is all YUEN Method, but they kind of overlap quite a bit. So the energetic testing, the numerical profiling to a certain extent, they're elements of each other. And then I have my two websites, thepowerofneutrality.com and nowenergetics.com, right? So, and there are sections about the basics in both of those websites. So, okay. So, and this is another really good article. So this is the worksheet. I'm going to put this up in this video. This is another really good article I wrote. Maybe I'll go through it in a video that I called it Drama, Drama, Drama. And this is another issue, another kind of take on going neutral. You know, where's the drama coming from? Where's the energy coming from that's creating this situation where you're not neutral to a certain situation, right? You're reacting in a situation. So kind of goes over and talks about that. So that's a pretty good article, and that's on the Power of Neutrality website here, so you can see. So, well, we'll leave it at that for now. It's been a kind of a long video to explain this worksheet, but I hope it helps people understand neutrality and working with energetic testing. And please like, subscribe, and share. And thank you for watching.